Welcome. We are going to do a CVT fluid and filter change. A good thing to do before you begin is to check the fluid level and see where it's at. See the condition of the fluid. Here I use a shop towel, shop rag, to show you the condition of the current fluid. This is the original fluid that's been in this 2012 Mitsubishi Lancer for going on 11 years now. And this is the location of the transmission dipstick in the engine bay. It could be slightly different depending on your application. The first step here is going to be to safely jack up your vehicle. And don't forget to put jack stands under the vehicle to keep it safe. Don't support the weight of the vehicle with just a jack. Definitely use jack stands.
I know you want me. Something in the air. I know you want me. Something in the air.
The next step is going to be to take off the underbody panels that are in the way. I have some tools here, a screwdriver and a panel clip remover to try to help remove these clips. Now, depending on your vehicle, these could be screws, bolts, plastic clips. In this particular instance, they're just plastic clips that pop out and push back in. And some of them will probably break upon taking them out. It's a good idea to have some replacements so that when they do break, you can replace them. And here's the location of the CVT oil pan. And now I'll take you around the outside. All these bolts holding the pan on are going to be what we have to take off to get access to the filter on the inside. Now here's a good example of what tool not to use for this drain plug on the CVT oil pan. I tried to use a wrench, but it doesn't fit very well. It has a very shallow grip on the drain pan bolt head. And as you see here, it'll just slip off. So make sure you have your drain pan underneath to catch all this fluid coming out. This particular CVT holds 7.1 quarts total. I think only about 6 quarts makes it out. It's a good idea to inspect the drain plug and the gasket. I'm going to be replacing this with one I use for oil changes. I'll show you that later.
I got a piece of my heart that's covered in gold. You know I'm one of a kind, or so I've been told. No matter where we go, I know we're gonna make it. No matter where we go, I know we're not alone. We face it all cause now we know that we can take it. We face it all cause we go big or we go home. Dance like you made it, you found it all. This is paradise. Dance like you made it, you found it all. This is paradise. This is paradise. This is paradise.
Yo!
So once the draining gets to a trickle like this, you can start taking the perimeter bolts of the pan out. I loosen them up with a breaker bar here. And keep the drain pan underneath, because once you remove almost all the bolts, you can tilt the pan to drain the rest of the fluid out of the pan. Even with the drain plug removed, not all of the fluid will make it out.
In the heavenly glow, we've come to adore. No matter where we go, I know we're gonna make it. No matter where we go, I know we're not alone. We face it all cause now we know that we can take it. We face it all cause we go big or we go home. Dance like you made it, you found it all. This is paradise. Dance like you made it, you found it all. This is paradise. This is paradise. This is paradise.
So now with the drain pan removed, I already removed the filter here. In the back there's a big hole where it's dripping from. It'll be dripping, that's why you want that drain pan to still be underneath. And if you're just changing the fluid, you don't need to take the pan off. You can just take the drain bolt off, replace the gasket, and then fill it with new fluid. But I'll show you the whole process here if you're doing it with the filters. So this is the old filter. Make sure you have your O-ring around the top of the filter, because it could still be stuck inside the hole in the valve body of the CVT. And this filter is looking pretty dirty, so it's a good thing I'm replacing this stuff. Of course, you're going to want to sop up all the fluid in the pan here as much as you can get. I don't use any cleaners on this. I just wipe it out with the shop towel and then wipe these magnets off because they have metal debris stuck on them. It almost is like sludge. And once you get most of the fluid out of the pan, you can go in with a clean shop towel and do a quick final wipe, because you want this as clean as possible. Your new fluid is going to be touching this, and if it's dirty, it's going to pick up that dirt and start circling it through your filters that you just replaced. So here's some of the sludge. Clean these off, and I switch to newer shop towels as I get more and more of the fluid picked up.
You can say hello, but I don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like. You can watch me go, cause I don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like me. You can say hello, but I don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like. You can watch me go, cause I don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like me. Don't need you to like me.
One thing you should do too is pay particular close attention to where the gasket seals on the perimeter of the pan. In this case, the gasket's stuck to the transmission and the pan has no gasket material on it or gasket at all. So wiping it with a shop towel was sufficient to keep it clean. But later we will go under the car and clean that gasket off of the transmission.
You are my lucky charm. I hold you close in the night in my arms. And when we open our eyes, my worries fade away. 'Cause you gave me your heart in the light of day, in the light of day. When we open our eyes, my worries fade away. 'Cause you gave me your heart in the light of day, in the light of day.
Here's a look at the new filter. It's a lot cleaner, so looks the same as the old filter. You want to check your parts that you're replacing to make sure they match up to the parts they are replacing. If they look similar, if they fit on the bolts, they fit in the same holes and everything, then it should be good. I'm gonna grab some fluid here and lube up the oil ring so it doesn't get stuck anywhere or pinch. You push it back into the hole that the old one came out of and try to line up the bolt holes. There's 3 bolts that hold this filter on. And one trick I learned to not cross thread any bolts is to back thread them until they snap into the threads, and then start threading them on forward.
We say our goodbyes and light up like fireflies, 'cause there's so many things left to explore. I don't wanna hold you back. Your heart is safe with mine, and I can't find the words to keep you, but I don't think I want to, 'cause we're living it up for love, living it up for love. Just keep living it up for love, living it up for love. Whatever is good for you, I'm good with it, I'm good with it. Whatever is good for you, I'm good with it, I'm good with it, I'm good with Tuesday, I'm all alone, but then you called my phone. You said, baby, I'm sorry, I'm on the road. I don't wanna hold you back, but I know that
Now here comes the fun part, removing the gasket, cleaning the surface off.
to keep you, but I know I don't have to, 'cause we're living it up for love, living it up for love.
Now if you're going to use a pry tool to get the gasket off, be careful. Don't scratch the surface of the transmission where it mounts to the oil pan, otherwise you could have a leak there. Just pry away from the transmission, you should be fine.
Whatever is good for you, I'm good with it, I'm good with it, I'm good with it. Just take my heart and get carried away, get carried away. Protect your spark, I won't let it fade. No, I won't let it fade.
Now for the mating surface, you're going to want to get this as clean as possible, because in order for your new gasket to seal properly, it just needs to be as clean and as smooth as you can get it. Of course, without damaging it. That's the tricky part. But don't forget to torque your filter bolts. I torqued these to 78 inch-pounds.
Whatever is good for you, I'm good with it, I'm good with it, I'm good with it, I'm good with it.
dropping, crushing and ripping it.
Terminating haters, started in the pieces, now we ballin' like the Lakers. Back up on the scene, ripping for my team, ripping off the industry. I'm on that Wolverine. Put me on vinyl records. Can I say? Green's the color of money, then put that broccoli in my plate. I've been working really hard and giving y'all niggas a reason to hate. Got a meeting with success, don't waste my time, I can't be late. Hip-hop swap, nigga, terminating haters. Started in the bleachers, now we ballin' like the Lakers. Back up on the scene, ripping for my team, ripping off the industry. I'm on that Wolverine. Put me on vinyl records, cause we dropping, crushing and ripping it.
Inside of me, you better watch out. If your enemy's a road ahead of full prophecy to be the greatest beast the world has ever seen.
And now it's time to get the new gasket on. Make sure you line it with the studs so that when you put your bolts in the pan that the holes will line up appropriately. And you want the pan to be as flat as possible. In hindsight, I believe it would have been helpful to have something or someone hold up the pan flat so that you can focus on putting the bolts in, because as you'll see me try a few times, if the angle is wrong, you're gonna sit with the oil pan not in position where you want it to be, and if it doesn't sit over the studs, it won't sit flat. So you need it to sit with the studs through the holes as well as the bolts through the holes in the gasket.
Pissed off quick, and if you cross him, you might drop dead. Metaphorically, of course, settling the score. Never getting bored, loves the blood and gore. Always wanting more freedom from the source. They don't really understand until they feel the force departed. If you start shit, you'll be heartless in the darkness. Torn apart quick, you left scars ripped. You'll be chewed up and discarded.
And this world ain't right, won't accept it. Negative energy, I expect it. Once it's in your mind, it's infectious. So fight for your life and reject it. You better give me space, I'm protective. My adrenaline spikes when I'm threatened. And if you stay in my way, I'm aggressive. Cause when there's no exit, I'll kill when I'm desperate.
Adrenaline pressure, it's stormy weather, lightning, thunder, pouring weather. Yo, I'm a go-getter, try to do it like me, but I do it better. I got a mind that's clever, the beast inside is competitive as ever. I'm conscious, my subconscious, an accomplice to me. I promise the darkness, I can honest believe. But don't cross me, I might lose control of the lost beast. He's locked away inside with the key controlled by fight or flight.
And this world ain't right, won't accept it. Negative energy, I expect it. Once it's in your mind, it's infectious. So fight for your life and reject it. You better give me space, I'm protective. My adrenaline spikes when I'm threatened. And if you stay in my way,
when there's no exit, I'll kill when I'm desperate.
Standing in the cold, cold rain, I don't even feel the pain. Anything to step away, I know we could both do better. Wish you would've left me here, now I'm just controlled by fear. What's the point in our reflection, if you never look in the mirror? Counting the days until you're gone, waiting for us to carry on.
But once you get the oil pan lined up, you will want to screw in the bolts that are most loose to the ones that are the tightest, so that you can get the pan to sit as flat as possible on its way up.
Maybe it's 'cause it's not enough. Setting fire to my brain, wondering how I'm to blame. You're the one who doesn't dream, so why are you always sleeping? I remember when you said you're afraid of what's ahead. What happened to ride or die? I asked and you just start crying. How are you acting so surprised? Haven't you seen it in my eyes? Oh, I'm running, what am I running from? Time's going by, but where's the time going? I tried to give you everything, you took it all and took it for granted. If you're still falling out of love, maybe it's 'cause I'm not enough.
I think it's about time to change that drain port gasket. So we'll take the old one off here. It's pretty flat, squished. I'll put a new one. I use these for oil changes, so I assume it'll be sufficient here. We'll see.
to keep us alive. Now all I can see is we're drifting apart. I can't believe how it all turned dark. Bring me the light, 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 bring me the
I'll go around the perimeter and tighten all the bolts. Of course, tighten all of these bolts to factory specs, and including the drain bolt. You're going to want that drain plug to be tight enough to squish the crush washer so that it does not leak.
can't believe how it all turned dark. Bring me to life. When the night is falling, I feel the darkness calling, like I'm afraid to love. No one can see me now. When the night is falling, I feel the darkness calling, like I'm afraid to love. No one can see me now. No one can see me
So I tighten all these bolts in a cross pattern, and then at the end I will go around the perimeter to make sure I didn't miss any. it's a good idea to clean off everything around where you're working so that when you start it up with new fluid you can check for leaks. Now I'm gonna pop off this panel that's on the side here because there's another filter in this CVT that is above. So I gotta take the driver's side wheel off and I'll have better access to the CVT oil cooler, which behind that is where a small paper filter similar to an oil filter sits. Taking a look around, there's this electrical cannon plug in the way. I'll remove that, which proves to be more difficult than it looks. You have to press in a tab that's on the grip of the cannon plug and unscrew it at the same time. I thought this C-clip around it had something to do with it, but I ended up putting that back on because it has nothing to do with the plug unplugging. Now once you get the cannon plug off, you'll have more access to the oil cooler above. I'll show you it here. Yeah, it looks like it's a bunch of metal plates stacked on each other. There's 4 bolts that hold it onto the transmission. So the bottom 2 bolts are easiest to get underneath here, and later I'll show you the top 2 bolts, getting them from above under the battery. now we're gonna have to take off the front air duct in order to get to the battery. And now we remove the battery. Now underneath the battery there's this plastic tray. It has a clip holding a wire harness to it. So we gotta remove that clip. Then we'll remove the battery tray. Now with the battery tray out of the way, it's a little easier to see the top of the oil cooler. So removing these two bolts will remove this bracket, which will give me better access to the one of the bolts. Now another trick I learned here is if you don't want to lose these bolts that you're removing from all these components, just put them back in without the component being tightened to it. I'm trying to get to remove these brackets. Get some tools. Now remember what I said about the right tool for the right job. This 1/4 inch socket is not the right size. So there we go. I end up breaking the extension and I give up on trying to take that part off. Found out you can just use a wrench here and remove these bolts without having to remove those brackets. It would be easier to get your hands in there with those brackets removed, but there's definitely that top bolt, and I think there's another bolt underneath. So they're not easy to get to and not easy to get off. I didn't quite have the tools available for this, but the wrench is my savior here. Now this is a close-up look at where those bolts are on the top. One is out here on the top right. Top left is still here, and there's a slot here. You can get to it, or you can get to it from closer to the transmission side. Right there. Now once you get the cooler off, you just gotta push it back. It has some coolant lines going to it, but I wasn't gonna disconnect those and have to refill the coolant. So you just push it out of your way. There's a filter in the transmission side. Just a small cartridge filter. It just pushes on. It's that circular shape on the inside there. I'll give you a close-up. This kind of sits on the top of the cooler housing here. But I found the easiest way to get this out with these brackets still in the way is to just kind of wiggle it a little bit. It'll loosen up, and if you can pull it, just pull it out. But wiggling it gets it loose, and then it's easier to come out. Now once you get this filter out, you're going to want to check and make sure that there is an O-ring on the front of it, a gasket. As long as you have the gasket with it, then it's not stuck in there. And when you put your new one on, you won't be pushing against the gasket. Here's my new filter. Install it, basically reverse operation of putting it on. You don't have to wiggle it really, you just have to find where the hole is, where that gasket sits on, and just push it on. You'll kind of feel it click into place. Now the next step is this O-ring on the cooler side. It's a really big O-ring that goes around the perimeter of that opening. I found I couldn't get it off with my fingers. It was either too slippery or too flat. But with the help of a pry tool, as long as you're very gentle here, because you do not want to scratch this surface, and just basically get underneath the gasket and pry it out. So here's the gasket, the O-ring removed, and good idea is to match it up with the one you bought. Make sure it is the same size. Here's the part number. for this. Good idea is to lube the O-ring before you install it. And I look at the oil cooler here and I see it's kind of dirty, so I'm going to take a shop towel and clean it off. Just give it a little wipe before I reinstall. The O-ring sits in a niche, so it won't pop out, but you have to line up the bolt holes and get the bolts back in to install this oil cooler. let's install this bracket back on. Now let's put our battery tray back in. Don't forget to re-clip the wiring harness back onto it. Also don't forget down below we had a Canon plug to re-plug in. The undercarriage panels and the wheel to put back on. Get the battery back in. Gotta tighten the terminal posts, and the battery tie down needs to go on. And here's the intake duct. Here's the intake duct hardware on. Check everything, make sure you got everything installed. Let's go back to the dipstick here and fill it with some fluid. Now checking here, it doesn't even register on the dipstick because we drained all the fluid out. But here's the high or the hot and cold areas. They're really hard to see. They're hard to see in person, let alone on the camera. But I ended up putting in almost 4 quarts of fluid here just to start it up and see where it sits. But I ended up needing 2 extra quarts. So in this particular car, the 2012 Mitsubishi Lancer, it seemed to have drained 6 quarts out, and I needed 6 to replace it. Now, in order to check the fluid properly, you're going to have to lower the car back down to a flat surface. You're going to have to run the car and go through the gear selectors, waiting 5 seconds in each. Reverse, neutral, drive. This one has low, and then I went back up, drive, neutral, reverse, back to park. Just waiting 5 seconds between changes. And then while the car is running, still in park, you're going to want to check the fluid and see that it's in the cold, if the fluid is cold and the engine is cold, or if it's in the hot section of the dipstick if the fluid is warm and the car is warmed up to operating temperature. Thanks for watching.